Something I call the whole bag of chips syndrome is if you like go to eat just one potato chip and then you end up eating the whole bag, or if you have like cravings for salty foods, that's going to be an indication that this might be an issue for you.
What is adrenal dysfunction? What are its symptoms and what can we do about it?
So, adrenal dysfunction, this is kind of one of those terms that's been thrown out there, I think, by the integrative community for quite some time. Maybe you've heard the word adrenal fatigue. And it's essentially a way to describe a cluster of symptoms that happens when we've been under chronic amounts of stress for some time. So, things like brain fog, fatigue, irritability, sleep issues, anxiety, mood swings, feeling wired but tired, having trouble getting up in the morning, light sensitivity, all of these kind of strange symptoms where I think a lot of us have felt at some point in our lives where we've been through a significant amount of stress and we just feel burned out. And it's a normal way for the body to respond to stress. The issue when it becomes dysfunctional is when we get stuck in that state. So some of us get burned out, we go through a tough time, we go through graduate school or whatever, and then we sleep it off, we get better, and we're back to being our normal energetic selves. The people that I've worked with over the last decade, they get stuck in that adrenal dysfunction where their body just doesn't produce the right amounts of stress hormones at the right times, and they end up feeling wired but tired, fatigued all the time. And these might be people with autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue syndrome, people that have burnout, coffee addiction. They might have, like wine dependency because they just can't fall asleep at night. And they're looking for ways to self-medicate themselves, but conventional medicine doesn't really have the answer for them. So from a conventional medical standpoint, it's like, okay, you're anxious, or here's some anti-anxiety medication, or maybe you're depressed, or here's a sleep aid, where it's really the body's natural response to stress that shifts us into that state. And then when we get stuck in that state, that's what adrenal dysfunction is. And we can come back from it. We can come back to feeling energized and full of vitality and having great sleep and having amazing brain function by sending our body the opposite of stress signals and the opposite of danger signals, which I call safety signals, essentially getting our body to go from surviving to thriving.
Wow. So powerful. You mentioned adrenal fatigue at the top. Is that like a real thing? Because I've heard some in like the so-called evidence-based camp say that like adrenal fatigue is not a real diagnosis. What's like the deal with that?
Yeah, and that's such a great thing. And over the years, I've heard leaky gut's not a real thing, but then when you look up medical journals, they focus on intestinal permeability. And right, if you can translate the the medical jargon, it just means leaky gut. And so there's actual evidence-based research for leaky gut, but you have to call it intestinal permeability. And the same goes with adrenal fatigue. So there's not a thing known as adrenal fatigue, but the same symptoms that are described by, I guess, old school naturopaths as adrenal fatigue, the evidence base for that is known as HPA axis dysfunction, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal dysfunction.
Wow, Gesundheit.
And so, yeah, bless you,
a mouthful.
Right? That's totally a mouthful. And so I just prefer to say adrenal fatigue or adrenal dysfunction because I'm not going to say, 35 words when I'm trying to talk to a client or a person that's listening.
There's probably a consequence to the fact that is such a so not a user-friendly term.
I think so.
Right? Like, I mean, if we could call it something that like, it's words matter, right? And if HPA axis dysfunction had a name that was a little bit more user-friendly, I feel like more people would be like aware of it. And with awareness comes, you're able to better manage something once you're aware of it, right?
Absolutely. And part of setting up an awareness campaign is letting people know that they have it and letting them know what to do about it. And sometimes I feel like we get caught up in the naming conventions where just the more accurate term, adrenal fatigue, is not an accurate term. So the adrenals are not actually tired and sluggish and sleepy. The adrenal glands, they're capable of producing stress hormones, but they've lost that communication pathway between the brain and the adrenals. So they're not releasing the right amounts at the right time, or they're releasing too much of the various hormones throughout the day. And that can lead to some of these symptoms where we're turning into like nocturnal creatures like your cat, right?
Yeah.
Where we're out and about at nighttime trying to like eat food and hunt for mice, and then we're exhausted during the day. And so part of the process is just really flipping that, just letting the body know that you're supposed to release the right amount of hormones during the day, and then to not release so many stress hormones in the evening.
Hmm. What are some of the adrenal gland associated hormones?
The most commonly known one is known as cortisol, right? And I know people hear cortisol. It's so bad. It's so bad, right? Cortisol, when you have too much cortisol, you end up with belly fat, right? Cortisol gets us to store fat when we have too much of it. And cortisol is not bad. It's actually necessary for life and survival. We do need to have just the right amounts of it. So typically we want to have the most cortisol in the morning and to kind of give us like a nice kick so we can jump out of bed. And then throughout the day, we want to have gradually a declining level of cortisol until we fall asleep at night and we have very little cortisol at bedtime so we could produce melatonin and get some really good restorative sleep. Now, the issue is if people don't have enough cortisol in the morning, then they actually have trouble waking up in the morning. And if they have too much cortisol at night, they're going to have trouble falling asleep. And this is one dysfunctional pattern that I call it the flipped cortisol curve, where you essentially turn into a nocturnal creature.
Wow.
And humans are not nocturnal. We don't have those special eyes that see in the dark, right?
Yeah, we're diurnal. We're meant to be active and at our best essentially during the day when the sun is out.
Mm-hmm.
And then we wind down at night. So how does this all start? Like, describe the cascade for me, because obviously the default state of any organism is health, right? It's not adrenal dysfunction. So what is it about the modern world that is causing so many of us to experience these kinds of symptoms?
I think back in the day, so we have this beautiful part of our body, part of our system called adaptive physiology that I like to think about, and it's the way that our body is wired to help us survive, right? And back in the caveman days, if we were chased by a tiger, we would release high amounts of cortisol to kind of help us get through that time. And now when the body prioritizes cortisol production, it's going to break down our amino acids, and that could lead to tissue destruction within our body. It's not going to be focusing on healing. It's not going to be focusing on sleep. It's not going to be focusing on digestion, restoration, all of these beautiful things that happen, right? When we get our rest and we're in the parasympathetic state. We don't want that when we're being chased by a tiger. And so it's a beautiful system that helps us survive.
It's like a reshuffling of priorities when in a state of stress.
Exactly. And it's designed so that we can get through a stressor and, escape from that tiger. And then we kind of shake it off and we calm down and then we feel better and we come back. Maybe we sleep it off, right? We get some rest and we come back and then we feel normal again, right? But the thing that happens, and I've talked to probably thousands of people at this point, and I always ask them, what was going on in your life before you got sick? And most of them will tell me that they were under a period of significant stress. Now, sometimes the stress is a divorce or a death in the family or a car accident or a bankruptcy or a loss of a job, something really tragic, right? Something that none of us want to happen. Sometimes, though, it can be even a stress like going to graduate school or having a baby or getting married or moving to a new city or starting a new job that really pushes you or starting a business, right? Even doing things that are good or exciting in our lives, they can still overwhelm our stress response. And then there are other things like toxic exposures or definitely things like getting exposed to various kind of illnesses that could lead to this kind of dysfunctional stress pattern where a person just constantly gets messages from their environment or even from their body that they're not safe and that they need to switch into survival mode, right? So this is typically what I see. And initially people start off with being in that survival mode and they're in a high cortisol state where they're just trying to push on through. And it's like, my goodness, you feel like you've had 4 to 6 cups of coffee. Everybody around you is so slow and annoying because how slow and stupid they are. And then as time goes on, you kind of burn out. Your body's like, okay, it's not great to have all this cortisol on board. I know you're still under stress, right? And so what are we going to do? And it sort of becomes like the boy that cried wolf, where yes, the body's perceiving stress, but instead of having high cortisol, it starts to downregulate the production of cortisol.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Why does that happen? Do we become, is it like, is there a degree of like cortisol resistance that occurs or yeah, like what's the mechanism?
That's a really good way to put it. I think what happens is the feedback loop. It's essentially where your body knows that too much cortisol can be an issue, and so it almost saves up cortisol
Hmm.
for when you really really need it. What I typically see is people initially will have cortisol swings where they'll start off with some blood sugar swings where they might have decent levels of cortisol in the morning, but then it plummets during
Hmm.
the day, and that can cause a lot of anxiety, kind of like that 3 p.m. crisis, right? When you're just maybe you're anxious or you're really, really need to take a nap. And then as time goes on, that becomes a bit more flatlined, where the people I've seen with chronic fatigue and autoimmune issues, they just have really low cortisol levels throughout the day. And their body just, doing things that are good stressors for people like cold plunges or fasting or training for a marathon, which for most people would be a really positive thing. These things can be actually overwhelming for people that are in that really low level of stress because their bodies are just overwhelmed essentially with all the stress that they've been all the stress signals that it's been
Yeah.
their body becomes overwhelmed with all of the stress signals that it's been receiving.
Wow. I've heard it described as allostatic overload.
Yeah.
Have you heard that concept? It's a really cool concept. I mean, that is essentially burnout. Like when your cup runneth over, so to speak, with all these different stressors, where something that could be otherwise beneficial, like intermittent fasting or sitting in a sauna or high intensity exercise, suddenly becomes like counterproductive to health.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of scary and there's different levels of dysfunction and I talk about that in my book at what stage you're in to figure out what kind of interventions would be best for you. But I know some people that are really fatigued and maybe they're looking to build their energy levels might hear of a trend that's really beneficial for others, but for them that might not be the right trend at that time in their healing journey.
So what should one do then? Is it to cut out those potentially beneficial activities, or is it to somehow get to the root cause of like the stress that they're experiencing that's less helpful, less productive?
So definitely part of what I recommend is looking at your current stressors and working on getting rid of the stressors. So if you have sometimes I had a review on one of my books that said I didn't need to do any of the things she said. I just quit my job that was toxic and then I healed myself, right? And I'm like, that's amazing. If you can identify a stressor like that, that's really obvious. Then yes, that's the answer.
Hmm.
If you're in a toxic relationship, if you're eating a toxic food, if you're in a toxic work environment, then that can absolutely be the trigger. And getting rid of that would be a key to your healing.
How does toxic food affect this pathway? Because generally, when people are eating the foods that you and I might consider toxic, they're probably having a good time when they're doing it, right? It's like fast food, comfort foods, things
Sure.
like that.
So, one of the ways that we trigger a danger signals in our bodies is through inflammation. And so, if we're eating foods that are inflammatory to us, in my experience, usually gluten, dairy, and soy are the most inflammatory to people with autoimmune issues, then that's going to be a stress signal in their bodies. And that
Hmm.
inflammation is going to tell their bodies that they're experiencing some kind of a stressor.
Hmm. So, first line of defense from a dietary standpoint, should everybody try cutting out gluten, dairy, soy, or is there a more sort of like nuanced recommendation?
One of the things I really focus on is blood sugar balance. So,
Hmm.
blood sugar swings can be inflammatory, and then not actually having not enough nutrients on board can be incredibly inflammatory. Part of my protocol, I focus on a paleo like diet where we're eating a lot of protein and fat throughout the day. And then we're cutting out some of the most inflammatory foods just to see, as part of an elimination program, if those might be triggers for you.
Yeah.
And I find that a lot of people, if they don't have an autoimmune condition, they can introduce those foods back safely. A lot of people with autoimmune conditions, they may need to keep them off of their plate for a longer time period.
Yeah, but I love the idea of like bio-individuality. Like these might not be triggers for everybody, but it's worth doing a kind of like elimination diet light just to see, right? It's like it's worth doing that kind of test for yourself.
Absolutely. And I think people really need to take the time to invest in their health and really focus in on their self-care. That's one of the ways to send safety signals to the body is to feed yourself really nourishing foods, high nutrient dense foods, and anti-inflammatory foods.
Yeah, I
And
love that.
that's a great place to start.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for sharing that. Is there a way to like how do you I mean you're obviously a functional medicine clinician, but like how is this typically tested for? And are there any home tests that you might recommend?
There are lots of tests that people can do, and if they work with a functional medicine practitioner, and there's also some self order options like Rupa these days where they can go and order their own adrenal tests. The adrenal saliva test, there's a company called ZRT that I really love, where you take your saliva at various times throughout the day, and it'll let you know how much cortisol you're producing throughout the day, and you can get a good estimate of what your cortisol curve might look like, right? If it needs to be supported at various times. There's a Dutch test that you can order by yourself, but it's a little bit tricky to interpret. So I always recommend working with a clinician. And that's a fabulous test for that as well. But you can also do tests in your own home. So if you are the kind of person, and I just posted a little Instagram thing about this. If you're having trouble with bright lights, so if you step outside and you're like a vampire and you need your sunglasses, that's a good sign that you might have adrenal dysfunction. If you're sitting up and then you get up and you're lightheaded, that's also going to be a big sign that you might have adrenal dysfunction. Something I call the whole bag of chips syndrome is if you like go to eat just one potato chip and then you end up eating the whole bag, or if you have like cravings for salty foods, that's going to be an indication that this might be an issue for you.
Why salty foods?
Salty foods, one of the things that happens with adrenal dysfunction is we end up with electrolyte imbalances. And actually, one of the keys to restoring adrenal balance is getting on electrolytes.
Interesting. My electrolyte game is on point thanks to Element,
Uh-huh.
which is I'm a huge fan, and I drink those things regularly. But I feel like a lot of these like what do you call it, whole bag syndrome
Whole bag of chips?
yeah, whole bag. Yeah, I mean I love that. I feel like that's something that so many people, including myself, can relate to. Like I often have experienced that when trying to just have a serving of. There was this brand they were making for a long time, paleo pretzels.
Ooh.
Yeah, they stopped making them. It was the brand Quinn.
Why?
I love Quinn, but like I mean, as a brand, they're great. But they used to make these like paleo pretzels. Then they stopped, and I'm actually kind of glad that they stopped because to be honest, I would buy them and I would literally like one serving for me would be the entire bag. So I don't know. Maybe I think I had like adrenal dysfunction, or is that just like those kinds of foods just beg to be overconsumed? I feel like.
I feel like when we're under a lot of stress, and I could tell you that whenever I'm cooking at home, if I have a stressful day, I'll taste the food and I'll be like, it needs more salt. It needs more salt, right? And chips are one way to get more salt into our bodies, but there are also things like electrolytes and utilizing sea salt. Have you heard of a beverage called Sol?
No.
So Sol is essentially you put a little bit of sea salt in a glass of water like this and you sip on it throughout the day. And that can help balance your stress response. So if you've ever have a stressful day, try that.
Interesting. So if people are craving like salty food, like acutely, like this isn't like the norm for them, but suddenly they have like a salt craving, that could be kind of like a sign, like a subjective sign that the stress is maybe too much.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Yeah, that's a good signal from the body that it needs some sort of comfort, right? And in that instance, I would recommend getting more sea salt into your system, more electrolytes, and definitely checking out Sol.
Wow. Is that a brand or is that like just a recipe?
Just a recipe. You can do it on your own. So you can do it with a big salt, big piece of salt, right? And throw that in a cup, or you can just add a little bit of sea salt
Whoa.
and mix it up in your morning beverage.
Crazy. Share your background for us, if you will.
My my training is I'm a pharmacist. So I
Love it.
went to pharmacy school and I was super passionate about medications and lots of drugs and every bug gets a drug and really passionate about wanting to find a cure for a disease one day and helping people take back their health. It wasn't until I got sick myself, and actually, I should say until I got diagnosed because I had been sick for about 10 years, that I realized that maybe medications weren't the answer to everything.
Hmm.
I was diagnosed with an autoimmune thyroid condition in my 20s, and I was at the time, I thought like, okay, great. I can take a medication and my fatigue will go away. I won't have to sleep for 12 hours away. I won't have pain in my body. I won't have these digestive issues. I won't have acid reflux. I won't have hair loss. I had all these awful symptoms for almost a decade. And then I started on the thyroid medication and I was like, okay, so I don't have to wear two jackets in Southern California. I only need one and I don't have to sleep 12 hours. I'm only sleeping 11 hours, but I still have all these other issues. And I wanted to figure out if I could perhaps get myself into remission, if there were lifestyle factors that contributed to my condition, if there was anything I could do to make myself better. And so that's how I became like a functional medicine expert slash human guinea pig, just trying to take back my own health.
That's amazing. That's such a relatable story. So it was Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Yes.
What describe that for us? Like what's that? What's having that feel like?
So it sounds like such an exotic condition, right? It sounds like a Japanese sword fighter or something really rare.
It does.
But it affects 1 in 5 women, and it's the primary cause of hypothyroidism in the United States. Like 97% of the time when people say they have a low thyroid, sluggish thyroid, they're hypothyroid, they have Hashimoto's. And Synthroid has always been one of the top prescribed drugs in America, top 5 list almost every year. And most of the people taking Synthroid actually do have Hashimoto's. So it's super common if you've ever been told that you have a sluggish thyroid, underactive thyroid, hypothyroidism, please look into it. You can get antibody testing for that. But I had this in my early 20s. Most women get it sometime around perimenopause when they're a
Wow.
little bit older. So I got it earlier on. And essentially, it's an autoimmune attack where your body begins to recognize your thyroid gland as a foreign invader and starts to break down your thyroid. In the initial stages, people will have normal thyroid function, but they'll be symptomatic. So I had panic attacks and hair loss. Other women will have multiple miscarriages. They might have obsessive compulsive disorder. I've had some clients that were hospitalized for psychotic disorders, for bipolar disorder. What happens is the autoimmune attack causes destruction of the thyroid tissue, and a whole bunch of thyroid hormone gets dumped into your bloodstream. Thyroid hormone affects every cell in the body. It runs our metabolism and it can run our emotions too. So when we get too much of it, people can have mood swings, anxiety, and then when it gets cleared out of the body, then they might have lows like depression. And so I'm very passionate about anybody who's going through miscarriages or hair loss or they have a quote unquote mood disorder. Please check your thyroid antibodies because that could be an early indicator. And if you just do the conventional medical tests, you might be told that your thyroid is normal.
Conventional medicine typically just tests what for TSH,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Is that so? That's not sufficient. You're saying that's not a sufficient test, particularly if you're having like unexplainable symptoms.
It's an excellent test for if you've had Hashimoto's for 10 years and for really, really advanced cases of hypothyroidism. But in the early stages, it probably takes about 10 years of having Hashimoto's and the attack on the thyroid gland before there's a change in the TSH. So you might be going, and this is what happened to me most of my 20s. I had these really annoying symptoms. I had carpal tunnel and hair loss and panic attacks and fatigue.
Wow.
And yet my thyroid was tested and always came back normal until a smart doctor thought to test my thyroid antibodies, and they were like through the roof. And so the early stages of Hashimoto's are just very confusing for a lot of people, can have a lot of symptoms. The later stages, when somebody actually becomes hypothyroid and when that TSH is elevated, and that's usually where most people are, diagnosed, they're going to struggle with fatigue, with weight issues, all of the things I already mentioned. They might have hair loss, they might have a loss of their upper eyebrows, they might have high cholesterol, they might have cold intolerance. Just really, you know, it affects the body from the top to the bottom.
Wow. That is so crazy. And this thyroid antibody test, is that like an inexpensive test that any doctor can do?
Any doctor can do this order, and this is the thing to ask for would be TPO antibodies and TG antibodies.
Hmm.
And I know a lot of people will say, my doctor won't order them. And so I'll say, okay, well, here are your options. One, you could find another
I'd
doctor.
get a new doctor.
Yeah, yeah. I know that's not an option for everybody. Two, you can self-order the tests for yourself. There's a lot of lab companies out there that let patients order their own labs. Love that. And three, another trick that another thyroid advocate, Mary Showman, had shared with me is she'll say, ask them to put it in the medical record that you asked for thyroid antibody tests and they declined it.
Hmm.
And once it goes on the record, I think a lot of doctors are more likely to take you seriously and say, you know what? I can order that test. And it's not expensive. I think for last time I checked, it was like $40 to just do the test when you're paying a lab out of pocket.
Worth it.
Totally
For
worth
sure.
it. You can identify what's going on within your body. And the amazing thing is, if you catch those thyroid antibodies early, there are a lot of interventions to reduce that inflammatory attack on the thyroid gland and perhaps, eliminate all of your symptoms and perhaps prevent the need for having medications long term.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So you mentioned, but correct me if I'm wrong, it takes about 10 years for this autoimmune destruction that's happening below the radar to be reflected in the TSH.
On average, that's how long it takes, depending. To get all technical, the higher the thyroid antibodies, the more aggressive the attack and the quicker that's going to happen. But just on average, it would be 10 years. For some people, if they have low antibodies, it might take longer. For people with really high antibodies, it might be shorter.
Wow. But that means like you can intervene
Absolutely.
as soon as you catch it, so to speak, and can potentially prevent further destruction.
It's just, yeah, further destruction, but it's heartbreaking because I'll work with some women in their 70s and they're like, I've had this condition for so long. Maybe I could have had children if I knew about this, or people that were misdiagnosed with horrible things and they were hospitalized, or they had treatment-resistant depression because they were taking all these antidepressants, but they didn't have a Prozac deficiency. They had a deficiency in thyroid hormone, right?
Yeah, wow. Of course. And so does adopting one of these like dietary protocols does it halt the process?
Yes, it's really, really interesting. When I first started trying to heal myself, I came across some research about the gluten-free diet and Hashimoto's. And in people who had both celiac disease and Hashimoto's, getting on a gluten-free diet helped to get rid of not just the celiac manifestations, but also Hashimoto's in a certain percentage of people. Now, not every single person that goes gluten-free will be healed from Hashimoto's, but in my experience, and I used to work in outcomes research, I'm a little bit nerdy.
We love it. I think you're awesome.
Thank you. I think you're awesome too.
Thank you.
About 88% of people feel better gluten-free when they have Hashimoto's. And they will say things like they have more energy, they lose weight, their brain fog goes away. And those are some of the more common symptoms of Hashimoto's. And I don't know how valid this data is. I didn't run it through a whole bunch of statisticians. But based on the people that said this intervention was helpful, more people found a gluten-free diet helpful for Hashimoto's symptoms than even taking thyroid medications.
Wow. Gluten, people tend to think of gluten as only something to be avoided if they have celiac disease. But there's a very interesting connection between, and I'm sure you can elucidate further, but like there's a very interesting connection between gluten and the thyroid.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there?
There are the antibodies to gluten. They can cross-react with some of the structures on the thyroid gland. So they're kind of similar the way their immune system works. It basically takes little snapshots of things it doesn't like,
Yeah.
and it kind of walks around and it says, okay, this is the guy we're attacking, right? And so when you introduce gluten, that can have similar protein sequences that the thyroid gland does. And so it's a
It's like molecular mimicry,
exactly.
right? It's
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's been a long time since I've reviewed this stuff, but essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong or mischaracterizing this, but it's like nobody properly digests gluten, and so in some those like peptides, those undigested peptides can end up in circulation, and our immune system sees them as like, what the hell is this doing here? And they attack
Hmm.
those gluten peptides. But there are like enzymes in the thyroid that look suspiciously like those gluten peptides. And so once like you have that autoimmune or once you have that immune response to gluten, it creates this autoimmune response in the thyroid. Does that
Exactly.
check out?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, wow. Thanks. I'm glad my memory is still
Well
working as
done.
well as it. No, but yeah, it's super interesting because it's like I think for people that are unfamiliar with this stuff, it's like, how could eating like bread possibly be causing, like a symptom with my thyroid? And then ultimately having all these like downstream consequences, like the high cholesterol, the sluggishness, everything that
Mhm.
you described. It's like probably a pretty foreign concept to most people.
When I started talking about this 10 years ago, and I was on Facebook a lot, that was like a big social media 10 years ago, people were really like hating me and trolling me. And they were like, you are crazy. What are you talking about? Gluten-free diet? What is wrong with you, right? That's never gonna work. And then they would be like, private message, actually, I went gluten-free and holy cow, like the swelling in my face is down. I don't have bloating anymore. There were women that they had like 8 different autoimmune disorders.
Wow.
And they were like, I don't have symptoms for any of these autoimmune conditions. And they would say, I tested negative for celiac disease. But yet going gluten-free, they feel so much better. And a lot of these symptoms just vanish. And yeah, there's just this thing about the immune system that if you're not digesting things properly, then it can cross-link the proteins that get into our bloodstream to tissues of our body. And that can manifest as autoimmunity, as well as other kinds of autoimmune conditions.
Wow, fascinating. Are there any foods to integrate that might help? We had Dr. Terry Walls on the podcast recently, who's done a lot of advocacy for certain foods that she feels have really helped her in her journey with MS, which is an autoimmune condition that affects the brain. Um, any foods that people should perhaps try to adopt as a way of mitigating these kinds of conditions?
One of the things that I really love is utilizing grass-fed beef. So this can be incredibly helpful. It's a rich source of carnitine, which helps to balance and stabilize thyroid hormones. Actually, low levels of carnitine were associated with thyroid fatigue. So this is something that I recommend for a lot of people. And it's I've had a lot of people that were vegan for health reasons, and they would have Hashimoto's, and they would come on and they would say, really, red meat has been a big part of my healing journey. And of course, you want to make sure that it's grass fed and not grain fed, and it's well sourced. The other thing that I oftentimes see a lot of people do really well with is going to be having extra protein on board. So having enough protein on board is going to be very repairing for the body. When we have an autoimmune condition, our needs for protein actually increase because the body tends to be breaking itself down more. And so providing ourselves with enough protein gives the body an opportunity to utilize the amino acids from protein to fix itself.
Wow. I had no idea about the carnitine connection.
It's fascinating.
Super. Where do you think autoimmunity comes from? I mean, it just seems like from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make any sense that our own body, our own immune systems would turn on the hand that feeds, so to speak, and start attacking host tissue. It's just like it doesn't make any sense. Where do you think it all comes from?
So I think so like the scientific consensus is that you have the genetic predisposition, and then you have some sort of a trigger, and then you have the intestinal permeability piece. And that's what ends up with that's how you end up with an autoimmune condition. From an adaptive physiology standpoint, I think it makes sense that we're under a significant amount of stress. Our body is going to go into survival mode
Hmm.
rather than thriving mode, right? And so let's say if we were in a famine, if we were in a war, if we were in a situation that was just not a safe time for us, what would be our best chance of survival, right? So for me, it probably would be to slow down my metabolism, slow down my fertility, not focus on growing hair, not focus on brain fog, not focus on socializing, or probably be good for me to go back and hide in my cave and hibernate, right? And so this is kind of a symptom of hypothyroidism, right? Is to have lowered fertility, to have slowed metabolism. So you don't need to eat as much food, but yet you hold on to your weight.
Yeah.
You're less likely to interact with others. And that can be something that's protective, right? To be hiding out in a cave during a famine and during a stressful time period. And my question for people is like, what are you doing right now in your life that's making your body think that we're in a famine or that we're in a war, that your body is responding this way to the environmental messages that it's getting?
Such a great way to frame it. You mentioned intestinal permeability a few times. What is that, and what causes that?
So this is in the medical journals. It's known as intestinal permeability. In like the common dialect, it's leaky gut. So essentially, our gut is supposed to have a barrier between the insides of our intestines and the rest of our body, right? And so when that becomes leaky, that's when we end up with reactions to foods and autoimmune reactions. We don't want those worlds mixing, right? We don't want to mix our poop with the rest of our body, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah. And then the other digestive things that happen is we don't absorb as much nutrients from the foods that we're eating when we have intestinal permeability or leaky gut. There are various things that can contribute to it. Food reactions, inflammatory foods, most likely gluten is the biggest one that's been associated with it. Dairy and soy can also be primary triggers for this. Other foods are usually secondary triggers, which means something else is causing it. But there are also stress depletions in amino acids from being in a prolonged stress response, specifically L-glutamine. This is a very key component of the gut wall. And then the other things that I feel like are very underappreciated are going to be things like chronic infections in the gut
Hmm.
or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Something that people don't talk about often enough, but parasites. And I'm not talking about like giant, huge, weird worms, not the Loch Ness monster in your belly. It's usually like protozoa
Hmm.
or bacteria that are in the gut that have pathogenic potential. And that can lead to intestinal permeability, food sensitivities, and even autoimmunity.
Damn. Where do those parasites come from? Just people pick them up?
Flies from other people, from water streams. The Giardia, for example, is something. Have you heard of beaver fever?
No. What's beaver fever?
It's not Bieber fever, but
It's not beaver fever.
no, yeah. So this is something that you would get from a stream in the wilderness, and it's a water that's been standing still, and that's not that's not circulating, right? And so different parasites might grow in there, like Giardia,
Hmm.
and this can cause inflammation in the gut. Typically, we think that it's, you'll get diarrhea and it's self-limiting and that it goes away on its own. Doesn't happen in everybody. And in fact, there was a study done in people with chronic fatigue syndrome that they had higher levels of this protozoa. For Hashimoto's, there's one called Blastocystis hominis, and it could be passed on between animals. So even cats, dogs, flies, people on farms are more likely to be exposed. And this is something that's been connected with irritable bowel syndrome, with chronic hives, and Hashimoto's. I started seeing this in my clients in 2013. And then a few years later, I was so excited. There was a medical journal publication talking about this protozoa, and if you can find it and address it, people with Hashimoto's can go into remission.
Oh, wow.
And not everybody will have the same kind of bugs and things, but that's just one potential trigger. There's so many different triggers out there, and it's a matter of figuring out which trigger is the one that's causing the issues in that particular person. And a part of that is always going to be helping the person rebalance their stress response, because that's always almost always affected in people with autoimmune issues.
So that should really be like the first line of defense, like doing an inventory, taking stock of where in your life all this undue stress could be coming from.
Absolutely.
Then perhaps like trying this elimination diet, the wheat or the gluten, the dairy, the soy, getting rid of those.
Mm-hmm.
But these are like, I love these two, doing this. I love that we're talking about this, because you can kind of like there's a degree of like detective work that you could do on your own. Because I know that, functional medicine, it's so great. Like I'm a huge fan of functional medicine, but it could be quite cost prohibitive for so many people, let alone access, right? Like not every town has a functional medicine practitioner in it. So these are like two things that you could do right off the bat, potentially, that I think could pay huge dividends.
Absolutely. And the reason why I wrote my book is because I know I worked with a lot of people, but I have even more people that follow me on social media and that email me, and they are always looking for people to work with them. Like, can you help me find a doctor? And I try my best. I have a list of functional medicine doctors on my website for that reason. But I also want to empower people to take charge of their own health. And my adrenal transformation protocol is focused on things people can do on their very own over the course of 4 weeks, without having to test their adrenals with an adrenal saliva test, without having to work. It's always helpful to work with a doctor, but without having to seek out somebody who really knows adrenals, without having to take hormones, which part of what I was trained in was using specific hormones to rebalance the stress response. Not everybody can use them. There's adverse reactions to hormones. We don't want too much of them, right? And everybody's a little bit different. They can metabolize them differently. And then people also don't have to do things that are not realistic, such as sleeping for 12 hours, which is an old school recommendation for adrenal dysfunction. And they also don't have to give up things like coffee or caffeine as they go through the process.
Wait, sleeping for 12 hours? That's like a recommendation. I don't unpack that.
So some of the recommendations, and we can go through the history of adrenal fatigue, when there was a wonderful naturopathic doctor, James Wilson, that coined the term. And back in the day, this was many, many years ago, and he was working with the assumption that adrenal fatigue was a mild cause of mild grade of Addison's, which is an autoimmune attack on the adrenal glands, where they're destroyed and they can no longer produce cortisol. Since that time, we've learned that this is not the case. The adrenals are perfectly healthy. They just can't produce cortisol at the right times because it's a miscommunication. But some of the early recommendations were to really focus in on hormones, right? And so these would be things like pregnenolone, DHEA, sometimes hydrocortisone, to help balance, to give the body what it doesn't have, right? And hydrocortisone, cortisol is important when you have Addison's disease, but it shouldn't necessarily be used for every person with adrenal dysfunction. The other recommendations were, okay, well, the adrenal dysfunction is probably caused by your lifestyle. You're not getting enough sleep and you're drinking too much coffee. And I used to be that person too, that I would tell my clients, they'd be like, I'm drinking so much coffee and I can't sleep. I'm like, quit drinking coffee, then you'll sleep better. And yes, that's a part of it, but it's also something that I've realized that people don't become addicted to coffee, or that people don't become adrenally dysfunctional because they're addicted to coffee. They usually get addicted to coffee because their adrenals are struggling in the first place. And
Wow.
Part of what I recommend these days is actually focusing on restoring your energy levels and rebalancing your circadian rhythm before I even mention anything about maybe cutting back on coffee use, right? Because I would tell people to stop drinking coffee. They'd be like, well, I quit drinking coffee and I'm still anxious and exhausted and I'm still waking up at night, but I'm also like more miserable because I'm not drinking coffee.
Yeah, those are fighting words for, I would
yeah.
say, most people. I mean, like coffee is such a great I go off coffee occasionally. Every couple of months or so, I'll do like a week or two or even three of of no coffee.
Like a cleanse?
Yeah, I'll switch to decaf, and I feel great. But then I bring it back, and I'm like, oh, it's like
Right.
you really feel like you understand why it's become such a staple for so many people around the world. I mean, it really is this like, I mean, it's a drug, but it's a pretty wonderful drug.
I think it enhances people's performance, right? And
And it
so
seems to be
people,
healthy. I
yeah.
mean, for the average person, right? Like when you look at
Mhm.
these observational studies on average, coffee seems to be a healthful beverage, right?
Absolutely. And I think if you have it in moderation, so if you're drinking a cup of coffee a day, 2 cups of coffee a day, that's great. When you get into the habit of drinking 3, 4, 5, 6 coffees a day, then maybe it stops being healthy, right? And if you have certain issues, let's say if you have estrogen dominance, right? Or if you have really bad anxiety, like coffee might not be the best fit for you in that time in your life, right?
Yeah. And some people, so you're saying, might actually be using it to like cover up, like to put a band aid over adrenal dysfunction.
Absolutely. So they're just so tired. They have trouble waking up in the morning. Normally, if we were healthy, we would wake up in the morning with energy, right?
Yeah.
And they wake up in a state of fog, right? And they can barely pull themselves out of the bed. So they depend on coffee to self medicate themselves to give them that rise in cortisol that should occur naturally.
Wow. What about food sensitivity tests? Are you a fan of these? Like, what do they actually show? Because I feel like you hear about them a lot, and then the last time I looked into them, what the consensus that I came to was that they tell you they can be a good indicator of gut dysfunction,
Hmm.
but generally not something that you necessarily want to take as gospel with regard to like these individual foods, because you might just be having like some general gut permeability that's causing you to react to these foods that you wouldn't otherwise be sensitive to.
When I first started investigating functional medicine with a skeptic's mind of a pharmacist, I came across various types of food sensitivity tests, and I'll tell you that all of their methodologies differ, right? So there might be one test that you might do and it'll test foods that are raw, and other tests might do foods that are cooked, and they'll look at different proteins and so on and so forth. And I found that not every test is super accurate. In fact, most of them are not accurate. Then the test that I found to be very accurate, and I've tested myself, my family members, hundreds of people with Hashimoto's, and it's like, okay, I have acid reflux, and it showed me that I'm sensitive to ginger. I cut out ginger, my acid reflux is gone. There's a company called Allostatic, and that's the only test that I would recommend and stand by. The test is an IgG test, and they do like 96 foods or 184 foods that you can get like something in the mail with a finger stick and stab yourself a little bit. And that's the only test I recommend. But with a caveat, most food sensitivities are secondary, right? And so sometimes people can get caught up in their food sensitivity test and say, okay, I react to kale. Kale's a bad food. I react to ginger. Ginger must be a bad food. But that's not necessarily the case. There are some primary foods that people tend to react to, gluten, dairy, and soy, that have been the primary drivers of intestinal permeability when people are sensitive to them. But most of the other foods are going to be secondary. So either you're reacting to them because you're eating gluten and that's causing your leaky gut, and other foods don't get digested properly, or you might have an H. pylori infection, which suppresses your stomach acid so that you don't digest your food properly.
Mm.
Or you might have a parasitic infection like Blastocystis hominis, which results in grain sensitivity. Or maybe you might have issues with sulfur metabolism, which could be caused by a molybdenum deficiency. So then you end up being egg sensitive. So there's a lot of these nuances that I've uncovered over the last decade about which food sensitivities are kind of the real deal, which testing is the real deal, and then what do we need to do when we react to these foods. And a lot of it is gut healing. A lot of it is addressing specific nutrients that might be deficient and act as cofactors in the metabolism of certain foods.
Wow. That's what I mean. Yeah. I mean, you summed that up so brilliantly. Like, that's what I kind of suspected because, it's like, I think a couple of years ago, I took a food sensitivity test. I couldn't tell you what kind of test it was. I mean, this is like many, many years ago. And I think green peas or something like snap peas was
Hmm.
something that turned out I was sensitive to on this test, which I've eaten lots of like snap peas throughout my life and I've never felt any kind of like, symptom from it. And I love them. I'm not, those are like not a food I'm willing to cut out. I just, they're super tasty, high protein, high fiber, great foods. And yeah, I just never knew where that came from. And I see people will text me all the time or DM me with like they've taken these food sensitivity tests and suddenly they can't eat like cinnamon or some like, random food. And it's just I always like internally like, I'm like raising an eyebrow because yeah, it doesn't seem likely to me that that like such a robust species, right? Like humans are like the most adaptable species on the planet would somehow suddenly be like have a sensitivity to like a random food that's
Hmm.
otherwise safe for so many people.
Absolutely. And it's usually there's something going on with the digestive process. And part of that could be the stress response that perhaps if you are under a lot of stress, that could suppress your secretory IgA levels, which is the first line of defense in our immune system, in our digestive tract. And so we might be more susceptible to having infections like H. pylori or parasitic infections or dysbiosis. And that could also lead to more food sensitivities too. So, one of the things that I typically recommend for people as part of the adrenal program is I know that they've been under a lot of stress. I'll recommend a probiotic yeast, which has been shown to raise secretory IgA levels. And that helps to clear out some of the pathogenic dysbiotic protozoa and bacteria naturally, just because it boosts our own defenses, right? There are
Wow.
certain things that can suppress it, like mold exposure or various infections. They kind of create an environment for themselves to make our intestines more cozy for them. And then obviously stress can suppress that immune response because when we're under stress, the body's like survival. It's not putting us in the thrive
Yeah. So wait, this is a
mode.
probiotic?
It's a probiotic yeast called Saccharomyces boulardii.
They give you that when you have like traveler's diarrhea, right?
Yes, yes. And it works well to prevent traveler's diarrhea. And it also works really well on so many different pathways from clearing out candida to getting rid of various parasites to working with if you've been exposed to antibiotics or mold or anything that could offset your microbiome. Taking that can restore more of a healthy microbiome.
And it encourages what more of the secretory, what is that?
It's secretory IgA, which is a protective immunoglobulin that helps our digestive tract thrive
Wow.
and
So
defends it from pathogens and helps prevent some food sensitivities.
wow, super interesting. What about dairy? Because dairy is something that I have been looking into quite a bit lately because I used to feel a certain way about dairy. I used to think that it was like something that needed to be avoided.
Yeah.
And I have had a shift in my thinking of, I still eat a gluten-free diet and I generally I don't eat much soy because I'm an omnivore. Although I'll do a little bit of like tamari sauce here and there on my sushi. But dairy is something that I have actually been like welcoming back. I do a lot of like whey protein. I do a lot of like Greek yogurt, which is a great protein source. Heavy cream in my coffee. I'm trying to think of all the different like dairies that I do. Yeah, I've become very dairy friendly and I feel good on it. Is this something that is that people are going to have like personal, like individual relationships with, or is this, part of that like triad that you say is like we're all better off um, minimizing?
I would say in the early stages of healing, and I've worked with lots of people with Hashimoto's, 80% of them feel better off of dairy. Definitely, if you have any digestive issues, try cutting out dairy. And my thought on it has evolved as well. So almost 5 years ago, I became a mom, and I had been dairy free at that time, and I started and I just the look of dairy, the smell of dairy was really grossing me out. My story was that I went dairy free and within 3 days my acid reflux went away, my IBS went away, carpal tunnel that I had for a few years went away. The acid reflux was there for like 3 years. IBS was there for like 10 years.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never doing dairy. And every time I would have it on accident or whatever, I'd get reflux and I'd have carpal tunnel, like I would have flare-ups even 5 years ago. And then lo and behold, I have a baby and then I'm nursing this baby and I started taking some lactation supplements and the dairy sensitivity went away.
Wow. What were some of those supplements?
Well, alfalfa, but I don't think most people should try them unless they want to, unless they want to like start lactating, right? And then carnitine was another one that I started taking, and it typically can become deficient in postpartum period. So it's actually now been added to some prenatal vitamins and vitamins for breastfeeding moms. And my dairy sensitivity went away, and all of a sudden dairy started smelling delicious and tasting delicious. And I know it wasn't like because I was breastfeeding, it was because of that time period that I started those supplements.
Whoa.
That it just shifted for me. And then doing a little bit more research and just trying to fact find all of like why this could happen, I realized that carnitine can shuttle fatty acids. And so with dairy being, a lot of times high in fat, people may react to that. So that could be one way to resolve the dairy sensitivity. And then alfalfa is rich in potassium. So if we don't have enough potassium, we could be dehydrated. And that's great that you're doing your electrolytes. Perhaps that was the reason that I wasn't tolerating dairy, and then I was able to shift that around. So
interesting. People tend to be sensitive to, is it the fat that people tend to be sensitive to, or like the casein or the lactose? I don't know. Are you lactose intolerant?
It depends on the person. So you could be lactose intolerant, right? So this is the sugar, right? And you could take Lactaid. You can be casein intolerant, so which is one type of protein. You could be whey intolerant, and you could also be sensitive to the fat. Now, I was so sensitive that I couldn't even do like ghee or butter,
Wow.
right? And so from that point on, I was able to have dairy. And I was like, I'd love to talk about it more, but I don't want everybody to take lactation supplements. But I think a lot of people can get the same benefit from utilizing electrolytes and perhaps carnitine.
Wait, so explain the electrolyte link. Like how does that connect to dairy sensitivity?
With when we're dehydrated, it just impairs our digestion. And when we have enough potassium on board, that can help with dairy digestion.
Got it. So staying hydrated, making sure we're tending to our electrolytes can actually improve digestion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, some of these things are just very, I guess, foundational, but just making sure that you're hydrating enough and utilizing electrolytes can be such a big game changer for a lot of the chronic health issues. And I talk about that in my my Adrenal Transformation Protocol book, some of the foundational ways of healing and supporting your body so that it goes into less of a defense mode, right? Because when we have food sensitivities, that's kind of your body is in defense mode. And so we're trying to shift that. Part of it is the elimination diet, and elimination diets are always more effective than any kind of food sensitivity test to see if you are indeed reacting to a particular food. And then it's giving yourself ample nutrients and ample support, electrolytes, ample magnesium, B vitamins, vitamin C, a lot of the things, potassium that get depleted when you're under heavy amounts of stress to really bring your body back into homeostasis, right?
Yeah. Have you ever tried like a carnivore style diet? Because I know that a lot of the people who report doing really well on those diets tend to have a background of pretty severe autoimmunity, allergies and things like that.
I was personally able to reverse my Hashimoto's and get into remission with a paleo diet. And this was a while back, and utilizing some functional medicine things. So cleaning up my gut, supporting my adrenals. So I haven't experimented with that, but I do know some people that have, and they do say it's beneficial. My question though is, what's going on in your digestive tract, right? So when I've studied like hundreds of gut tests of people with Hashimoto's, and I look at the patterns and I see, okay, if you have this type of bacteria and protozoa, then you might have deficiencies in digestive enzymes that help you digest fiber and vegetables, right? And then if you have H. pylori, you might react more likely to protein foods. And then sometimes you might have issues with your elastase, and which helps you digest fat. relating foods. So I oftentimes wonder, like, have these people had a full workup to see what's going on in their digestive tract? Do they have some sort of creatures living in there that are preventing them from digesting fiber, right? Because I ultimately want people to be on a very diverse diet, as diverse as possible. Like, I don't want to be that person that's like, okay, here's my ice cube that I'm eating and everybody is out at dinner and having a great time, right? I
Yeah.
want people to thrive in the modern world and just learn how to send themselves ample safety signals through, nutrition and mindset and mind body practices and some of these hacks to be able to thrive in the modern world, right?
Yeah, and part of what I think what it means to thrive, and I wonder if you agree, is like resilience. Is that quality of resilience where you can go out and eat a diverse diet and not react to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I when I was first on my healing journey, I tried a particular diet that didn't work for me, this specific carbohydrate diet. And I got into this, and I've never had like eating disorders. I've never I'm European, so we don't have as many body issues there, I guess. So I was just always like happy go lucky, but I thought this diet was going to heal me and it was the perfect diet, and yet I got like very thin, my skin was turning gray, my hair was falling out, I was losing muscle mass, and turned out I was reacting to like too many almonds and nuts and things that were in this diet. But I kind of had this thought process, like, I just need to eat a perfect diet and then I'll be healed. And a lot of people get into that state with food as medicine, unfortunately, where they're like, I just have to have a perfect diet and whatnot and I'll be healed. And that's not a very healthy way to be. Like, I want people to be able to be really intuitive and tune into their bodies and be able to understand what they need right there in the moment to feel their best. And part of it sometimes is, being able to go out with friends and socialize and bringing back some of that diversity. And that's why I focus a lot in the adrenal transformation protocol. I focus a lot on building resilience, whether that's healing your gut and healing your stress response so that you can show up in the world as your best self, no matter how stressed you are, right?
Yeah, totally. You mentioned you're European. Where were you born here in the US or were you born there?
I'm from Poland.
Oh,
So
you
I was
are?
born in Poland.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, amazing.
I came to the States
Warsaw?
when I was 9. Lublin.
Lublin.
Yes. Have you been to Poland?
No, I'd love to go, but never been.
Okay. Well, we might be going next summer.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
For like a family vacation or what?
Yes, probably for a family vacation to show my little son Poland. He's going to
Wow.
be a little bit older now. He's going to be 5 pretty soon.
Congrats.
And
That's so cool.
thank you so
So
much.
great.
But there's a lot of fabulous places to visit and foods to try out. It's really interesting. I think a lot of people talk about how European food is better and they don't react to it. And I think part of the reason why is maybe when you go on vacation to Europe, you're not as stressed, right?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think you're right. What is like traditional Polish food typically? It's a lot of like sausages and stuff.
There's definitely sausages. So Polish kielbasa is a traditional food. You can get that gluten free.
Also, pierogies.
Pierogi,
Yeah.
yes. Those are kind of like, like that's wheat flour and there's usually cheese inside of them. So,
Not
I'm
gonna
like,
beat any of those.
yeah, if anybody, if a Polish girl can give up her pierogi to heal, like anybody could do it. Anybody can go on a gluten-free, dairy-free diet for 4 weeks, right?
Yeah.
There's also ways to make these things gluten and dairy-free. So with all of the advances nowadays, you can utilize various types of alternatives.
You got a good gluten and dairy free pierogi recipe?
I can share it with you. I don't know it offhand, but yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
no, please. My middle brother's girlfriend is Polish.
Oh, she is.
And she makes pierogies, but I don't eat them because I just I generally try to avoid wheat. But yeah, I grew up where my family, we're Ashkenazi Jews,
Mhm.
so we have a little bit of Polish in us. Like
Mhm.
that, my ancestry is like definitely rooted firmly in that part of the world. Although I couldn't tell you exactly where. And so growing up, my grandma would make pierogies for us, and they were so good with like onions and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very good food.
They're like, describe them for the audience. They're like dumplings, right? They're like a Polish dumpling, but with,
Yeah, I
in a
think people
way.
would say it's kind of like ravioli, but
Mm.
with cheese and potato mixed in the middle. And it doesn't sound as delicious, but it really, really is delicious. But you can make you can replace that with various things that are out there. So I'd be happy to share a recipe with you. I'll
Love
hook
it.
you up. Don't worry.
You'll hook me up?
Yeah.
Sweet.
I got all the goods.
You got all the goods. What else? So your book is out. I'm super, super excited for that. I think a lot of people are struggling with like adrenal dysfunction today, probably. I mean, we live in stressful times, so it's a fair assumption to make. So I feel like your work is going to provide, will be very valuable to a lot of people. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there. Do you think that the early exposure to antibiotics could have possibly played a role in the development of MS?
Oh, absolutely.